We are living in a mad, mad world, my friends. A world of poverty, discrimination, terror, and other stuff. I don't know, I live in a suburban neighborhood. None of this applies to me. There are many things in this world that people worry about. Are we safe? Can we trust our governments? Is the world going to end? It's irrelevant questions like that steer us away from the true conundrums this universe has to offer. Like, what's up with graphic novels these days? Why is the bestseller list full of webtoons, brand tie-ins, and wannabe manga? That's not how things were when I was a kid. We used to be a proper country, one where everyone agreed communism was gay, pronouns didn't exist, and the best-selling graphic novel series of all time was Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Although, to be honest, now that I think about it, it actually wasn't my favorite growing up. I did read it actively throughout all of elementary school, starting when Hard Truth was the newest book and stopping once Double Down came around, but it wasn't the first or last series I did that with by a long shot. It was just one of a bunch I'd ask my grandma to buy for me when we went to the bookstore after school. Back then I read Big Nate, Middle School, iFunny, Timmy Failure, pretty much anything that followed tweenage boys being radical troublemaking artists. A trope that admittedly was first made popular by Captain Underpants, another favorite of mine. But for real, when it came to the self-narrated, anecdotal, down-to-earth style of storytelling these series all shared, Wimpy Kid was 100% the inspiration, as back when it released, it kinda shook the industry with its unique approach to narrative and humor. Here was a series that didn't strive to present its stories in the typical beginning, middle, and end structure, opting instead to build themselves around character-focused skits presented as short diary entries from the perspective of a kid in middle school. But not just any kid, a wimpy kid. Or in other words, a dick. And that's not an exaggeration. Greg Heffley, as far as children's book protags go, was groundbreaking for the time that he straight up wasn't a guy you rooted for or even found all that likable. And paradoxically, that was his charm. He was a hypercritical, egotistical jackass that abused his count 'em, one friendship, and a majority of the comedy came from the schadenfreude of seeing him face consequences for it. Each book chronicles him failing to pull off a selfish scheme or plan and deal with the fallout. Whether he's trying to game his mom's fake money system or start a lawn care business where his friend did all the work. It's a cynically hilarious, downright mean collection of books that isn't afraid to let its main character be selfish or rude or inconsiderate because we know he's eventually gonna get his shit kicked in. And before you try to say that a kid being this way is unrealistic, let me tell you this. No, it isn't. Everyone has known a kid like Greg before. Maybe not as potentially sociopathic, I'll give you that, but definitely to some extent. On the surface, he may be a Machiavellian parody of a human being, but if you peel back the layers of mental illness to reveal what he is at the root of his character, Greg represents everything hateable about children. The arrogance, the stubbornness, the punchability you have to restrain since punching kids is morally unethical. Readers loved that such a bastard could be the lead of a children's book, giving the series a fun edge that adults could enjoy just as much as kids for portraying them as the little shit stains they are. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, for all the tykes who couldn't get that Greg sucked, including me, you could relate to him and his struggles, not realizing you were the problem. It had a little something for everyone in a funny, easily readable format, so it's no wonder the franchise took off and sold a bazillion copies. It would have been stranger if it didn't. It was a big trailblazer for the more experimental shit kids like me got to read during the early 2010s, so in that sense, while I did have a bigger passion for middle school and Big Nate growing up, I've also got a deep respect for Wimpy Kid, and to me, the first 5 or so books are nearly untouchable in their consistency. I can't deny their quality and the positive influence they brought to the subgenre, no matter how many Dork Diaries books get made, which one of my relatives would always get me not understanding there was a difference, Aunt Susan, you whore! But I digress. They're good books that I enjoy, even if I don't have as much to say about them as other series. I'll tell you what I do have a lot to say about, though, the movies. Specifically, the original live-action theatrical trilogy released between 2010 and 2012 respectively. Wait, 2010? But that's 14 years ago. Sorry, mortality aneurysm. But yeah, in regards to quality, they're amazing films. Especially when you take into account the unorthodox source material they had to work with. I mean, there literally weren't any larger events to build a film around. They basically had to Frankenstein narratives together from what they had. And the weird thing is, it didn't lead to a total disaster. Against all odds, all three of them are fantastic adaptations in their own rights. It's almost inhuman how, same as the books, they found a way to stay good while giving each subsequent entry its own distinct voice. And when you put them all together, they form a new cohesive arc, swerving the franchise in a totally different direction that's incredibly faithful at the same time. You honestly couldn't ask for more from one adaptation, let alone three. And 8-year-old me might not have known that at the time, but if anything, I did know I was experiencing peak cinema. But since this video is entitled How the Wimpy Kid Trilogy Cured My Depression or something clickbaity like that, you can probably guess that wasn't where it ended. After all, Wimpy Kid never stopped being a popular book series. It's still running today. Somehow. So obviously, the enthusiasm for further adaptations has stayed high. And considering how often Hollywood reboots franchises when nobody asked, you can only imagine how they'd react to genuine requests. Ah, so this is what that shopkeep meant when I wished on that monkey's paw. Now, if you're in the know of the Wimpy Kid community, which may be the dorkiest thing I've ever said, you've most likely already heard that this attempted reboot, The Long Haul, wasn't exactly everyone, or who am I kidding, anyone's favorites. As a matter of fact, everyone hated it, including me, even if, at the time, I didn't really think about why. I could tell it was bad and a poor imitation of the other Wimpy Kid films, but I couldn't quite put it into words, seeing as so much of it seemed to be replicating what the original did. The direction, presentation, characters, all of it was familiar, more or less, but it just didn't work. And at the time, I was too caught up in my guilty atheist at Christian middle school phase to watch anything but Armored Skeptic, so I didn't think to look at reviews to help clarify this gut feeling. It just sat dormant inside me like a stilted tumor, waiting to come back worse than ever until, well, the franchise did. This time as an animated take on the series written by the book author who wanted to make an improved version of his original story. And with that in mind, I was super excited until I watched it and noticed it's Long Haul again! Another attempt to recreate the magic of that live-action trilogy gone horribly wrong. And then it happened again with the sequel, and okay, it didn't happen a third time with the sequel to that, but it wasn't good either. And after the release of that third animated film, I finally saw the full picture. Universally beloved source material known by a majority of children worldwide. Adaptations so good they became the basis for every interpretation to follow. Terrible new versions that miss the point and don't have any decent excuse for being made besides money. This whole time, I was missing the truth right in front of me. These films were made so that I could do a sequel to the Seuss video. It all makes sense. It's so clear now. How else do you explain all the boxes being checked here? It can't be a coincidence. The only logical explanation has to be that everything in the universe inevitably comes back to me. And hey, Jeff Kinney, I like your style, so you've twisted my arm. I'll do it. But only because you wanted me to. This is to adapt A Wimpy Kid. The best, the botched, and the animated. I know I sort of forced that rhyme there, but I wanted it to match. I don't have to justify myself to you. Eat shit. But how are you supposed to go about fashioning a conventional 3-act story out of Diary of a Wimpy Kid? For the first 3 books or so, there's barely a plot at all. Like, sure, they all follow a linear timeline and theme, each one taking place over several months and juggling a couple related topics, but aside from that, they're mostly a collection of disconnected vignettes and interjections put into book form. You know, like a diary. It's part of the authenticity. Kids tend to write about what they find interesting from their perspective, and more often than not, they don't have anything interesting going on. They wake up, they go to school, they watch cartoons, they go to sleep. It can get tedious. So, breaking it up into these short bursts of random excitement like the books do makes sense. That's how diaries are. They don't need to have a meaning or focus or much of a structure at all, and that's why it must have been so hard imagining how it would translate to film. All those things things I just listed are seen as necessary building blocks for a good movie, at least traditionally, and I don't think Wimpy Kid was looking to be the next low-budget foreign art house project, so for it to work, the new writers had to make changes. But don't get the wrong idea, by change, I don't mean throwing the original out and starting from scratch, that would be stupid. No, what this and the other live-action films choose to do is way smarter. They take the events of the book, look at what's needed for the story they want to tell, chop off all the pieces they don't need, and reorganize the rest to build new overarching narratives, allowing them to keep most of the book's content while optimizing them for a new format and carving out their own identity. For instance, in this film's case, it still takes place over a full school year, and a majority of the book's recognizable moments are kept intact, but a handful of lesser characters and scenes are removed to keep it mainly centered around Greg's friendship with his best friend Rowley. See, in the original book, arguably the least concentrated out of the series, it tends to keep a balance between stories about Rowley, Greg's family, and his school life, occasionally letting them cross over when it would be convenient, and it worked in that context as the books wanted to show us every facet of Greg's life. But if left as is, it would have made for a jumbled screenplay, and I know it'll be controversial, but I'm just gonna say it, I don't think we'd be missing much if P-Mud was cut. Sorry, not sorry. They needed to tighten it up, for lack of a better phrase. So, as a compromise to make sure nothing major was cut, they pulled back the family stuff, saving their time to shine for later films, and mixed Rowley and school together to form a new plotline. One where Greg wants to find popularity in middle school, assuming he's destined for greatness, and needs to fix Rowley if they want any shot at staying friends. That's right, believe it or not, none of those things are anywhere near as big in the book as they are here. Greg joining extracurriculars hoping he'll get respect? Just a bunch of ploys at taking advantage of perks. Him vying for the yearbook comes up as a brief goal near the end. Him wanting to alter Rowley so they can be popular together, the main conflict of the film, is a single one-off line about him thinking Rowley is lame and needs fixing. Even one of the most iconic images from the franchise, the thing that's used in all the book's advertisements nowadays, the cheese touch, shockingly barely matters or holds any of the meaning it does in the movie. Here, the cheese is the ultimate representation of the film's message, an ever-looming artificial barrier for social status that the students themselves made up, symbolizing how the one thing keeping kids like Greg from getting along with kids like Rowley are their own stupid perceptions of social hierarchy. Meanwhile, in the book, it's a brief side note mentioned a grand total of once about 8 pages in before completely vanishing till the very end, when it comes back as an excuse for getting Greg and Rowley back together after they stop being friends. There's no weight, no heart, no deeper meaning. It's actually kind of insane how much less the cheese matters in the books than it does here, and I'd say the main cause for why is that it lacks build-up. It's one of the few things you can reasonably criticize the older Wimpy Kid books for. Oftentimes, they'll have these compelling setups or ideas for plot points that could be explored in greater detail, but then they aren't. So, by the end, when they come back to get resolved out of nowhere, you don't feel as satisfied as you could be. There's always something missing that could have made it hit harder, and the film demonstrates this perfectly through how it builds up to Rowley and Greg's breakup using the same events as the book. Originally, the way it went was that Greg kept convincing Rowley to participate in all these schemes purely to have a fall guy in case he needed one, repeatedly abusing his trust and getting karmically punished for it until this one specific action finally gets Rowley to cut him loose. It's undoubtedly a gratifying development as it is, giving us a taste of Greg's life without Rowley in it to point and laugh at him for being such a pathetic loser, but what's unsatisfying is that the breakup wasn't a result of escalation. Rowley isn't doing this as a result of all the harm Greg's done to him across the entirety of the book. No, he's only mad at Greg for this one thing, as shown by how he forgives Greg after he covers for Rowley without any of the meaning it has in the film, insinuating it basically made them even. Greg let Rowley take the fall for him terrorizing kindergartners, so him taking the fall for Rowley eating the cheese is enough to get them back together, and that doesn't quite sit right with me, as in, it definitely fit the tone of the books, and arguably, it's a more accurate take on how kids fall out and make up, doing it over little things instead of culminating factors, but given just how many times Greg does this shit, I am left with the feeling that it should have led to something more. But then again, that could be my bias showing from remembering how brilliantly their relationship is recontextualized in the film to make this scene as powerful as it becomes. I mean, if you look at their friendship from the book's perspective, it isn't depicted as being all that important to either of them in the first place, Greg especially. He doesn't see any value in Rowley whatsoever, claiming he's easily replaceable and mostly using him to take out the pent-up aggression he has against his older brother Rodrick. Like, this man disrespected Zooey Mama. He'll mock anything about Rowley just to feel better about the fact he gets 0 bitches. So why does he stick up for him at the end in the book, you ask? Well, there are a few interpretations you could take, seeing as Greg isn't going to be too open about it, but if you're asking me, I'd say it was a move made out of desperation. Think about it. Greg had spent all his time since he and Rowley broke up trying to find a replacement or some level of popularity, and failed disastrously while Rowley succeeded. So, as a last-ditch effort at getting back the one person who was oblivious enough to tolerate him, Greg threw a Hail Mary knowing he had nothing to lose, and hey, whatever the outcome, he'd be getting some grade A blackmail material to hold over Rowley's head for as long as he wanted. Is that the true meaning? Possibly not, but you gotta admit, it wouldn't be out of character. The whole message you're supposed to take away from the two's relationship in the book is that Greg's a bad influence who manipulates a good kid into doing his dirty work, constantly backfiring on him as a punishment. It's a cautionary tale about how Greg, in his arrogance and selfish jackassery, will keep losing as Rowley wins, never understanding why to our amusement. It's part of why I wish there was a bigger reaction from Rowley when he finally broke things off. It definitely would have clashed with his naive characterization in the book, so I get why it didn't happen, but it would have felt so good to see anyway, and it totally is in the film, though admittedly for vastly different reasons. You see, a major difference between the book and movie is that the film wants you to care about Greg and his friendship with Rowley. It's the centerpiece of the whole thing. If the friendship stuff isn't good, the rest isn't gonna be either. They need that strong foundation for the version of this story they're trying to tell, so how do they do it? By turning Greg into less of a malicious prick. Emphasis on malicious. Oh, he's still an asshole. You couldn't get rid of that and keep him the same character if you tried. But you could alter the place that dickishness is coming from. For example, in the book, Greg straight up says that Rowley is replaceable and easy to trick. Those are statements of fact that Greg consciously believes with no ambiguity about it. Whereas in the film, he consciously believes he wants Rowley to be popular with him, thinking everything he's doing is for Rowley's benefit. However, in attempting to fix him, we see that Greg, in essence, wants to turn Rowley into something else and doesn't respect him. He's conveying his subconscious thoughts through his actions. It's great visual storytelling that clues us into how this iteration of the character isn't self-aware about his own asshole status like book Greg is. He isn't aware how he's perceived by others, as subtly implied by both this slight but noticeable change in his thought process and how his personal social rank starts out much higher in the film than it is in the book. It's all done for the purpose of conveying that despite Greg's jerkish behavior, his intentions aren't, wanting to hold on to Rowley as his friend regardless of how middle school might make it difficult. He's not intentionally trying to hurt anyone, but he finally starts to recognize that's exactly what he's been doing after Rowley has enough of his shit, and in the film, this moment has been building. We've gotten glimpses of foreshadowing and one-off lines and gestures that Rowley has been wising up to Greg's behavior as he keeps screwing him over, and finally, after doing something so absolutely awful he couldn't plausibly take it any other way, Rowley snaps. Or rather, he comes to a realization. There's no yelling involved in his call out of Greg. You can tell he isn't angry, he's shocked and crushed, finally understanding that his friend isn't the person he thought he was. It's no wonder the phrase, "You know what, Greg? You're not a good friend," is so memorable. Aside from being blunt and concise, it's effective. You feel everything Rowley's processing in his head as he says it, and it's such a Rowley thing to say too. He's not insulting Greg, he's being honest. You can't get mad at the man for saying it, and the only excuse Greg has for doing so is that he doesn't want to admit he's right. It's an interesting role reversal where, for once, Greg is the one who's naively clueless while Rowley is self-aware. That sort of thematic irony would never happen in the books, and so, to me, this is where the films truly made a statement that they were their own thing. Up to here, you could have made the argument it was reworked solely for optimization, but here, we finally register that these thematic choices and recontextualizations were made to eventually express that characters in this universe aren't gonna stay stagnant, repeating the same mistakes over and over to comedic effect. And truth be told, as an adaptation decision, I don't have issues with that. Keeping everyone virtually identical at all times obviously works under the specific circumstances and tone of the books, but being that, well, these guys aren't immortal cartoon characters and physically age over time, it makes sense to let them grow mentally as well. Plus, it doesn't take away from the comedy, it just adds another layer with a dash of sincerity using proper escalation. That's another reason why the fight between Rowley and Greg, followed by the cheese touch scene, is so immaculate here. In the book, the moment is a little forced, coming about from a minor argument, and like I said before, reading as though it was inserted just to resolve them being broken up. Not to mention Rowley dissociating from Greg happened about 20 minutes before the fight, so no matter how much time is implied to have passed, it doesn't feel that way. And the film surprisingly gives a justification of sorts for why that is in-universe. Following the breakup, which FYI happens way earlier to give it time to sink in, there's this period Greg is miserable and keeps embarrassing himself, so he tries writing about how he totally doesn't care that Rowley's hanging out with somebody else, and it's not like he likes him or anything, but he gets frustrated and can't find the words. I'm honestly not sure if it was a deliberate choice or not, but if so, it's a pretty clever detail that accentuates Greg's struggle to admit he's in the wrong, continually getting beaten down by his own actions until he does what Rowley did. He flips out, just not at the right person. If Greg were real with himself or had even a hint of modesty, he would have been able to see that the one deserving of all the blame for how shitty his life has become is him. But he's ironically not as emotionally mature as Rowley. He doesn't have the capacity to self-reflect, so instead, he lashes out at the one person he thinks he can blame. It's another instance of that build-up in character work I cited earlier, creating a scenario that's believable and serves as a second thematic climax. All the comedy of the scene is unaltered, from the two having no idea how to fight to the kids not taking in what Greg says because he has the cheese touch, but there's a deeper meaning to the sacrifice that signifies the first steps of Greg becoming a better person. I'm not necessarily saying the book version is bad by comparison. It has its own priorities and does what it wants to do well, but to me, this ending was the last sign I needed to know that the live-action trilogy was as unmistakably phenomenal as I remembered it. Unironically, I'd go as far as to say it's a near flawless adaptation, save for the inclusion of this new character, Audrey, whose role in the film is so categorically worthless, I intentionally gave her the wrong name just now, and you probably didn't notice. In actuality, her name is Angie, and from what I can gather, the goal of her being here, besides appealing to the girls 8 to 11 markets, is to act as the film's resident mouthpiece to restate the themes in case you wouldn't have gotten them otherwise. Anytime Greg and Rowley fail at being popular, she's there to rub it in their faces, reiterating how stupid what they're doing currently is. Anytime someone talks about improving society, she's there to proclaim how they participate in one. Whenever the audience is getting too comfortable engaging with the media using their own brains, she's got a monologue ready about how bullshit society is and reminds you that middle school is basically Nazi Germany, so you might as well not give a fuck. That's all she contributes. It's why I was able to go this entire section without feeling the need to name her once. Her presence across the story is about as annoying as your deadbeat dad who wants to pretend that he still cares. She shows up every so often to drop some sagely wisdom you previously read on the back of a Snapple cap. She goes away for literal in-universe months off-screen, and in the end, she leaves such a small impact, it's a wonder why she bothered at all. And the disappointing
disappointing thing about her character is that she had the potential to add to the commentary, yet it's never addressed. The parallels she has with Greg and how they think. Just look side by side at what the two say about middle school. They're roughly the same thing. The only difference is that Greg wants to participate in the system and Angie doesn't, so by virtue of them clashing on the topic, they don't get along. It would have been the perfect opportunity to address how like-minded people can be torn apart by social structures just as much as those who've got nothing in common. But she never has a conversation with Greg that's long enough for this to become apparent, and it's a weird discrepancy, as every other character with expanded roles in this doesn't feel nearly as tacked on. Sharad Gupta helps deliver exposition as a kid who's been bullied his whole life, Patty Farrell becomes the physical manifestation of Greg receiving karma, Fregley admittedly doesn't have much new material, but he's hilariously charming thanks to his actor's performance, and Rodrick... Actually, to tell you why Rodrick works, we're gonna have to move on to... Okay, so following the trend of the first movie, Rodrick Rules decides to downplay the book's less important sections to focus on the relationship between Greg and Rodrick, a dynamic we got to see a glimpse of before that was shockingly already more complex than anything the books ever did. And thus in lies the problem here. Greg and Rodrick's relationship in the books isn't memorable. In fact, it's barely present at all. And I say that as someone who's recently binged through 9 Wimpy Kid books in preparation for this video, so trust me when I say it's not deep. As far as I can tell, whenever Greg and Rodrick do interact in the books, 95% of the time, it's gonna come down to one of 3 scenarios. Rodrick gives Greg bad advice and he takes it, losing his kidneys or something in the process. Greg has a plan that either does or doesn't require Rodrick and he messes it up, or they fight. There is no in-between. It's a very prototypical older-younger sibling relationship that can make for good comedy, but virtually never strays from those listed setups or says anything deep about them. And there's a simple explanation for why. Rodrick isn't a deep character. There's this misconception among certain fans that he merely comes off as dumb because he puts all his effort into what he's passionate about and doesn't bother with the rest, tricking others into doing those things for him, but in the case of the books, that's false. He isn't smart at all. Occasionally, he can trick other people into doing things for him, usually unintentionally, but his plans, similar to Greg's, almost always go wrong, in his case owing to his glaring stupidity. Take the mom buck situation. The way that whole thing initially goes is that after Susan, the mom, comes up with his stupid exchange program of getting real money for fake ones the boys can earn, Greg finds the board game she got it from and figures he can cruise off the stash for as long as he likes. That plan falls apart though when Greg needs to turn in a paper and has to ask for help from Rodrick, who takes advantage of his desperation to snatch $200 for an essay it turns out wasn't any good. Clever shit, right? Well, it completely comes undone in an instant when Rodrick attempts to cash it all in at once and reveals Greg's scam, not comprehending how suspicious doing that would be considering he's hardly ever worked a day in his life. That's a good summation of how Rodrick is. Once in a while, he can pull off these simple but effective bamboozles, whether purposely or not, but he doesn't think things through, so he often ends up suffering the consequences. But I understand why people keep mistaking him for a secret genius. After all, the films are so convincing at reinterpreting every little detail of his character, I questioned if I was reading the books wrong myself. It's that unbelievable how well they add depth to his character simply by viewing what he does from an alternate lens, that being intentionally. In the books, like I said, it's just as likely for him to deliberately get his way as he is to stumble into good fortune, and if he ever benefits from something with no downside, 9 times out of 10, it's gonna be clarified that Rodrick didn't intend it. He doesn't mean to set a standard of low expectations so people will be surprised when he does anything. He isn't trying to get out of work by being stupid. No, he naturally accomplishes that by being totally useless 99% of the time. But what if he wasn't? What if, in reality, beneath his smooth-brained facade, Rodrick was self-aware of what he was doing the whole time? Why, that would change everything without needing to change anything. It would be so completely opposite of what the books are going for, but at the same time, it would work, and if we're being legit, it'd be better. The idea that Rodrick can't do much but knows and actively doesn't care, embracing what he's good at and using those skills to move closer to what he wants, disregarding everything else? That would be fucking jaw-dropping. And it's precisely what Rodrick Rules does with no room for interpretation. Point blank, Rodrick is smart and enthusiastic when he wants to be. He's no longer an idle NPC stuck sleeping in his basement for 80% of the story that comes up for 1 or 2 scenes to mess with Greg. He has his own drive and aspirations and a solid grasp of what his strengths are, and he uses them to his advantage whenever he can. What's that? Rodrick is so brain dead he doesn't know how to type, meaning Frank the dad does his work for him out of compulsion? I think you mean Rodrick exploits his dad's low expectations to get free A's, wasting no effort on his part. Wait, what do you say? Rodrick absent-mindedly wipes shit down with a dirty rag? Ha! Gotcha again, bitch. He knew the whole time. No more chores for him. And it doesn't stop at what he accidentally did in the books either. They seriously want to hammer it home to you that this Rodrick knows what he's doing. So to make sure they have all their bases loaded, they turn the mom buck scheme into his idea that he keeps a secret to the bitter end. This man knows what he's doing. He'll bang your wife, convince her to divorce you, and not call her again since she doesn't want to listen to his band's new single. That's the type of guy Rodrick's become. And beyond being the greatest adaptation decision of all time, it's also essential to Greg and Rodrick's friendship in this film being feasible. I mean, as it originally was, they didn't have anything to gain from speaking to each other outside of obligation, and that tracked with their personalities. One was a lazy teen, the other a scheming narcissist. Neither had anything to gain from a friendship with the other, and due to their far more basic, stagnant character traits, they couldn't possibly have anything to respect the other for. However, as you may have noticed, half of that issue was solved in the last film by ending it with Greg overcoming his narcissism, meaning he could get down from his high horse to see Rodrick's positive traits. Ergo, what this film needed to do was give Rodrick traits to be appreciated for, while keeping in line with the book counterpart so their early disconnect still checked out. Thus, Rodrick, from the first film onward, stays a jerk to Greg that likes picking on him, but his rationale for doing so is that he doesn't respect Greg or see him as a priority. He needed grounds to see him as more than another carefully placed dog turd blocking his path, and this film allows him to do just that by not snitching about a party Rodrick throws, demonstrating a value he didn't see in Greg before and opening the gates for them to start bonding. It's a supernatural conclusion for the two to reach after seeing them grow across their respective films, and if that wasn't enough on its own, they keep going the extra mile by creating bonding moments out of reinterpreted bits from the book. As you're reading them out in their original context, it's clear Greg wants us to think Rodrick is stupid for laughing at fake vomit and using a microphone to scream somebody farted. He's throwing shade, as his bitch ass tends to do, but as a result of them bonding before that stuff happens here, they're reworked into endearing moments of the two having fun, yet again developing their bond using practically nothing but modified original material. It's almost a new experience entirely unto itself, and yet you can't say it's not a good adaptation, as it keeps close to everything from the book and does nothing but improve upon it. Rodrick's party happens and ends up being found out identically to how it was in the book, but the party itself is spun into a catalyst for him and Greg bonding, and them getting caught is a death blow to their new friendship that shatters Rodrick's self-confidence hearing he can't perform in the talent show he was preparing for across the film. It's this movie's own Greg betrays rally moment where his actions, in this case buckling and telling Susan about the party, breaks the trust Rodrick gave him, but it arguably hits harder this time since we know Greg regretted what he did, and Rodrick isn't quite crushed, more broken. The single thing he cares about most in this world has been denied to him, and one of the few other things he recently decided to care about was the cause, so in turn, he doesn't quite know how to react. Any response he could give wouldn't be enough to express how he's feeling, but it's summed up well in how he delivers the line, "You're my brother, but you'll never be my friend." That one sentence is an emotional sucker punch to your nuts, and it colors the Leisure Tower scene after, since it isn't there for a couple more wacky, tormenting Greg scenes anymore. It's an emotional rock bottom for the two's relationship that then gets resolved during the talent show when Greg once again sacrifices something, in this case his dignity, for the sake of someone else. It's a fantastic place for the film to round off that puts a nice little cherry on the reimagined sundae that is Greg and Rodrick's relationship, and for each change after that, sprinkles. The biggest of which, Holly Hills, is basically given a new role entirely. Here she's got a major role in the plot with top billing and everything, but if you look back at the books she mainly appeared in, The Last Straw, she barely says a word, and that made sense. The whole purpose of her character was that Greg didn't know anything about her, but thought they'd be a great couple regardless, making it all the more hilarious that she had no idea who he was. It was a great subversion of expectations that justified Holly's small presence in that book, but it wouldn't have fit the less egomaniacal Greg of this film, so instead, she's introduced as the object of his desire, but through learning they have shared struggles battling siblings, the two unexpectedly connect and end up becoming friends. Yeah, surprisingly, they don't get together right away, and honestly, I'll take that over a sudden, inexplicable love interest any day. It's a shift from the books that's drastic, that's for sure, but they knew not to take it too far or risk coming off cliche. A compliment I can equally give to this film's version of the parents, who, like Rodrick, were given greater depth from the beginning, but I didn't get a chance to bring them up until now. They're nothing too crazy, mostly taking their old traits of straight-laced wannabe family man and doting nag to comedic extremes, but they've also got a mix of subtle and heartfelt scenes, in no small part thanks to their phenomenal actors. To one side, Rachel Harris does the impossible of radically morphing Susan into a likable character that isn't perfect but has a genuine heart, and to the other, Steve Zahn is able to take undoubtedly the least compelling member of the Heffley family and turn him into an unhinged eldritch being of calamity. But if I really want to dive into him, we're gonna have to move on to... Wait a second, this is the same transition as before. Why am I such an uncreative hack? So starting things off by addressing the obvious, anyone that's seen this film can tell you that Dog Days fits weirdly into the adaptation discussion for the reason that, although it loosely carries ideas over from Dog Days and The Last Straw, it's got by far the most original content, and that's because of the permanent status quo changes the last two films made to the franchise. I briefly mentioned before how each film has Greg fighting to form or attain bonds and learn lessons he didn't in the original, but it can't be overstated how significantly that ends up affecting this movie. I just got done talking about how Holly was spun to avoid her disappearance after Rodrick Rules, so as you'd expect, one of Greg's primary goals in Dog Days becomes getting closer to her. And that's only the least of what this film had to do. Again, as I brought up a second ago, in all the books, including Dog Days, Greg and Rodrick don't form a connection, so they don't have any motivation to hang out. In fact, it might be the book where Rodrick appears the least by volume, since he and Greg have no incentive to interact, but that's not the case anymore. They're friendly now, if still brothers that enjoy messing around, and Greg is going after Holly, meaning her sister Heather is free game, so to give Rodrick a role instead of awkwardly cutting him out, he attempts to woo her, and it is glorious. But possibly the choice that led to the biggest shifts this time around has to be how they adjusted the story to fit in line with the theme of Greg salvaging a failing relationship. First it was his friend, then his brother, now it's his dad. And what's funny is that, based on a quick glance at the source material, it doesn't seem like something that would need too much adjustment to work. Looking at Last Straw, the more prominent inspiration for this film, don't question it, it was first and foremost about Greg not living up to Frank's expectations to the point he almost sent him off to military school, so by that description alone, it already sounds like it generally fits the framework of the films. Theoretically, with that in mind, all it would take to format the material would be fitting the Frank-centric events in the Dog Days summer setting and keep track of all the newer continuity, right? Wrong. To the contrary, I'd argue Last Straw is one of the hardest books to adapt to the Wimpy Kid film formula, as it's built on a relationship that's non-existent. Like, if you were sad Greg and Rodrick didn't talk enough, get ready to be fucking devastated, cause all of Greg and Frank's bits in the book can be boiled down to a gif of Hank Hill going, "That boy ain't right." And that's all of Last Straw. Greg wears a woman's bathrobe and uses an air vent to heat himself up.
That boy ain't right.
Greg doesn't exercise.
That boy ain't right.
Greg doesn't do well at soccer.
That boy ain't right.
Time after time after time again, it's nothing but a constant barrage of Frank being disappointed in Greg for not acting masculine or embarrassing him. And to be clear, I'm not complaining about that, far from it. Last Straw is actually one of my favorite books in the series, and this dynamic makes for some of Kinney's absolute best comedic writing. But the problem with adapting it that the film writers must have noticed is Greg and Frank hardly ever interact. They don't share any of the struggles presented in the book together. It's always either Greg getting himself in a bad situation and Frank reacting, or Frank getting Greg in a bad situation and reacting. Frank himself doesn't participate. He doesn't aspire to connect with Greg on any level beyond forcing activities onto him and fucking off until the worst possible moments. The book is about Greg and Frank not seeing eye to eye on things, leading to wacky situations, but Frank isn't involved in them, so there's never any progression or development to speak of. Even the ending is a gag. Granted, it's a good gag, one that cleverly reincorporates a bunch of various callbacks, but it does so totally independent of the characters and their relationships. Two things that by now you should know the films use as a foundation for everything else. This isn't like Rodrick and Greg, where the crew doesn't have much to work with, but can keep a majority of the scenes by giving them new context. Frank and Greg don't have enough scenes to recontextualize, so for most of the film, the crew have to stretch and add on to what they do have for as long as possible, and to their credit, it does get them pretty far. On one hand, they're able to create interactions by taking chunks from Dog Days, specifically everything related to Sweetie and the country club, and altering them so they have more to do with Frank and Greg attempting to get along. They also turn every instance of the two almost hanging out into them actually doing it, so each scenario can better describe to us why the two don't mesh. And of course, as is customary for these films, to ensure that Frank has a personality to clash against Greg's, they accentuate the few things the book tells us about him to inform deeper traits to be explored. His battle diorama obsession becomes an excuse to escape from his family, giving him a motivation to suddenly get involved in Greg's life when Susan points it out. His endless search for traditional masculinity transforms into a deep-seated insecurity driving his standards for what's normal. His disappointment in Greg doesn't come from being embarrassed at his mistakes, but his inability to own up to those mistakes after making them. Any place they could add character, they did, and all of that's great. It's undoubtedly the best the team could do while functioning within the limitations of the book. However, on the other hand, no matter how well they can form characters out of basic features and unrelated moments, there's no getting around the fact that if they're looking to have another big finale where Greg and Frank find common ground, the ending of the book doesn't work in any context. Like I said, it's a funny ending with good execution, having Frank mistake Greg being a fuck-up for saving him and calling off military school as a thanks, but it doesn't solve anything outside of the short term. All that's changed is that Frank goes back on the military option, and that makes sense for the book, where Greg is way more worried about that than getting along with his dad, but it goes against everything the films have built their identity around, so what's their solution? Reinterpretation isn't gonna cut it, and however they try to slant it, there's nothing to add that could flip the meaning, so practically speaking, that leaves them with only one option: to go off script. Oh yeah, they go there. Diary of a Wimpy Kid Dog Days does indeed commit the adaptation cardinal sin of diverging from its primary work to do a near fully original third act. And I'm not gonna lie to you for a second, it's damn good and fits right in effortlessly. The whole thing takes its concept from a short arc in the book where Greg joins the Boy Scouts, expanding it into a full camping trip with Frank as a camp counselor alongside the guy that made him insecure about his masculinity, and it's a pure genius reimagining. At first, I was a bit skeptical about how well they could handle veering away from the source entirely, but thankfully, those fears got supplanted real quick when I realized this version is technically still following the events of the book in its own way. Or rather, it captures the spirit of the original work while focusing on delivering an emotional resolution to the arc it set up. See, as the climax of the story, instead of Greg accidentally embarrassing himself and saving Frank by doing so, in the film, he actively tries to get back at the other counselor for bad-mouthing him to others. And when that plan, let's be real, inevitably fails, Greg does something he's never done before in the franchise. Admit to his mistake. And it's especially hard-hitting in this case, as Greg doesn't try to justify himself or argue that he was doing it to protect Frank's honor, something that sets this mess up apart from all his others that were mainly the result of accidents or selfishness. It would have been the perfect opportunity to make an excuse if he wanted to, but Greg just owns up to his mistake to keep the others from getting in trouble, knowing that's the right thing to do, and as his accidental sacrifice unwittingly got him the respect of his dad in the book, his deliberate actions here do the same, demonstrating to Frank that his son isn't a bad kid. He might make a ton of mistakes and have a hard time confessing as much a lot of the time, but he's willing to admit it when he has the most to lose and the least to gain. So for Frank, that's enough to let him know he was wrong about Greg and stick up for him against his own former bully, finding an understanding and completing the trifecta of Greg mending his broken relationships. If you're asking me, it's quite a high note to end the franchise on, considering how narratively consistent and thematically conclusive it is, but seeing as it and so many other portions of the film aren't from the book, it does also raise an important question. Can adding so much original content stop a film from being a good adaptation? I sort of tiptoed around this discussion during the Seuss video for the sake of sticking to the rhyme scheme. Stupid, I know. But to answer it here in my opinion, I don't think adding on to what a piece of media did is ever a negative if it doesn't worsen or contradict the end product by doing so. And in the case of the Wimpy Kid trilogy as a whole, I'd have a tough time finding any additions that fit that description other than Angie, but ignoring her? Every creative choice develops the film's own mythos and identity without forgetting the Wimpy Kid brand, basing around 90% of its content off the books while adding their own depth, narrative, themes, relationships. They even bring over the secondary cast for each subsequent film so they can help the world continue to feel as fleshed out as in the first. Not a single decision, besides Angie, gave any indication that the writers didn't get Wimpy Kid or what it was about. If anything, all the new shit it provided contributed to an experience that, depending on what you're looking for, is better than the books. And them being able to naturally insert their own new material is the ultimate testament to that. It really makes me wonder what could have been if the cast got a fourth film adapting Hard Truth, which would have been perfect as the cast was getting older and Hard Truth is all about puberty, it was right there. But having said that, Dog Days is a fairly conclusive note to end on, so I can't complain too hard. Boy, am I glad that this live-action franchise remained a trilogy. Alright, here we go. 5 years after Dog Days hit theaters, the Fire Nation attacked. We, the viewing public, were graced with the release of the new Diary of a Wimpy Kid film, The Long Haul, a semi-reboot based on the 9th book in the series of the same name. Why did they choose to skip ahead so far over starting from the beginning like any normal reboot would do? Well, according to the second Wimpy Kid movie diary, The Next Chapter, which I paid real human money for, Long Haul was the first book in the series written with getting a film adaptation in mind. And judging by its uniquely simplified format, I definitely believe it. Whereas the earlier diaries are fairly scattershot in their approach to having a main focus, jumping around and going off on a lot of tangents whenever possible, this was the first one that seemed dead set on sticking to one premise in a short time frame where each event flowed directly into the next. There aren't any major side stories, no unexpected twists, no major jumps in time. It's as straightforward as a Wimpy Kid book can be, so therefore, hypothetically speaking, sure, it would be the easiest to adapt. But, and I hate to break this to you guys, easy isn't exactly a word related to quality in the movie-making business. You know what else was an easy film to make? Boo, a Medea Halloween. They shot that thing in 6 days, and it shows too. That's what making a movie easy looks like. And before you think about telling me that comparing Long Haul to a Tyler Perry movie is unfair, I want to let you know that I agree. Tyler Perry doesn't deserve to be disrespected like that. At least I know what I'm getting myself into when I watch one of his movies. There's an expectation of trashiness there. I don't go to a fucking McDonald's and order medium rare filet mignon, but that's what this movie did. did. It made me think I was going to a fancy restaurant to get another premium quality steak grilled to perfection, but then I got served a goddamn Happy Meal. You made me look like an asshole, movie. How was I supposed to know you were gonna be dog shit? Almost all the same people worked on you. The director, producers, editor, cinematographer, composer, all they switched behind the scenes was writing, but these films have switched those up before with no problems. Plus, the new guys are the director of the last two films and Jeff Kinney, the original author himself. So once again, I repeat, how was I supposed to know this was gonna be terrible? Okay, that's a fair point, but the topic I was trying to lead into is that before I ever watched the movie, I had to read the book. And to be frank, I don't like it. I'm not sure where it's ranked in the greater scheme of the series. From what I've looked at, it seems to be placed on a lower end of the spectrum by fans, but as someone who's reread a good amount of Wimpy Kid in preparation for this video, I can tell you that compared to pretty much any other book that came before it, Long Haul is the worst by a good margin. I wouldn't exactly say it's the worst Wimpy Kid book I've ever read, but if there was one book out of the first 9 that I flat out wouldn't have picked to be adapted into a film, it would have been Long Haul, since on a fundamental level, it has massive issues going all the way back to its premise, a Heffley family road trip. What's wrong with that exactly? Agency. In Long Haul, Greg doesn't have it, and that's a massive problem. I don't think I brought it up before now, as it's such a foundational pillar of how Wimpy Kid functions, I'd assume it goes without saying, but one common denominator among basically all the worthwhile books and movies is that Greg brings about his own torments. Losing Rowley's friendship? His fault. The mom buck scam getting found out? His fault. Every plan of his over the course of the series backfiring? You guessed it, Manny's fault. But seriously, for a Wimpy Kid anything to work, Greg has to be the root cause of his own suffering. That's why it's funny. If you remove that element of control from why he's facing the wrath of God, it's less funny, more depressing. And that's how Long Haul is, given that Greg has no control over where the family goes or what they do. He's merely a passenger in the car reacting to situations as they come. So whatever misery those situations cause, in turn, isn't his fault, meaning the pain he endures isn't justified. There's no satisfaction you get from watching Greg suffer alongside his family, since he didn't do anything to warrant it. Even in scenarios where it's framed as if Greg was at fault, it's never from any direct behavior, always equating to a misunderstanding or an inconsequential action leading to a snowball effect. There's a clear lack of karmic justice in all these moments, and it taints the books from beginning to end, so by extension, it's only logical that the films would follow suit. I will give it a teensy bit more credit than the book for having Greg switch the end goal of their journey to a gamer convention, but that's the most influence he ever has. It doesn't change the fact that most of what he's forced to go through could hardly be blamed on him. And if that wasn't enough of an argument not to turn Long Haul into a film, Greg's actual characterization in it definitely is. So this is something I haven't once heard anyone talk about when discussing the books, but is it me, or does Greg slowly lose his edge as they go on? Like, for example, in the original book, Greg is a fairly grounded depiction of a middle schooler. He doesn't believe anything too outrageous besides the common stuff a kid his age would think. He's kind of an egotistical schemer and an all-around douche that doesn't care about anyone besides himself. You get the drill. We've been discussing this version of the character for over 40 minutes now, and in the books, that's how he stays up until around Dog Days, where he starts acting a little funny. A smidge foolish, if you will. And it was subtle at first. An assumption of getting arrested if he turned in an overdue library book here, a passive comment about taking pills that stop you from aging there, but by the time we got to Cabin Fever, a book with a subplot about Greg being scared of a bully who turned out to be 5, it became apparent. Kenny was slowly making Greg more and more childishly naive. He was losing that initial cynicism his character was known for, morphing from a self-aware, uncaring dirtbag that created all his problems he has to deal with, into a vaguely sarcastic, unassuming kid that seemingly had misfortune unfairly drawn to him. And nowhere is that more evident than in Long Haul. It is a book where Greg's at his least cunning, least jerky, least perceptive, and worse yet, most sympathetic. If you hadn't read a Wimpy Kid book before Long Haul, you'd be scratching your head wondering why this innocent boy who didn't do through nothing is constantly berated by a series of worsening circumstances. You are required to have read earlier entries in the series just so you'll understand what they're going for in terms of comedy. And if anything, it's worse in the film, seeing as 1, it's a reboot, meaning you shouldn't have to have seen anything before it to get what's going on, and 2, all the qualities I listed that undermine Greg as a character are pumped up to 11 here, or should I say they're downplayed? Because this kid has nothing that made Greg fun or interesting. And it doesn't match the book version either, so you can't get away with the excuse that it's accurate. He's already way more annoying and childish than the book version by making him a fan of this derpishly hateable fat Let's Player, complete with colored hair, a shitty catchphrase, and insert tasteless joke about Minecraft YouTubers contacting young fans to meet up here. But that could have been forgiven to some extent if he wasn't so boring. A word I never thought I'd use to describe Greg Heffley, but due to a mix of infantilization, lack of agency, bad writing, and bad acting, it's beyond fitting. Greg is supposed to be a smart, charismatic, confident, narcissistic con man with poor execution. Those are his main defining traits. But his confidence and charm got thrown out by his new actor, who sounds like he's reading a cue card right off frame in every scene. His narcissism is flat out non-existent, and as I mentioned before, disregarding the brief map tampering, he doesn't do a single thing that could be considered intelligent. It's hard to tell who the crew thinks they're fooling, saying this nondescript, unremarkable kid is Greg, but I ain't buying it. And for the most part, his family doesn't fare any better. Depending on what you see as an upside, you could praise Rodrick for being the closest to his book counterparts, but considering that by this entry, Rodrick had become so flanderized he could barely put 2 feet in front of him without cartwheeling into a wood chipper, that might not be a positive. Oh, and while I'm stating the obvious, this script would be a hard sell for Devin Bostic, so do you seriously think this guy has a shot at winning you over? Mr. fucking Momo challenge over here? Right, I didn't think so. And the same goes for Frank, who once again is arguably close to his book counterpart, but all that means is that he's got the personality of a block of wood. It also doesn't help that he 100% looks like the "we've got Steve Zahn at home" of people. But hey, dull is better than absolutely fucking infuriating, which is how I'd label Susan. And look, she isn't exactly my favorite character in the books either. Her whole deal is being a stereotypically out-of-touch mom that uses preschool punishments on her teenage sons. And in Long Haul specifically, her main role is instigating the road trip, hoping it'll lead to family bonding, only for everything to fall apart. But here's the thing. Here's what makes Susan in the books at least slightly bearable. She doesn't intend to make her kids' lives miserable. She wants to be a good parent. All that's stopping her is her outright cluelessness and over-reliance on parenting books to guide how she acts. There's a certain innocence to her character that translates into the overprotective but supportive Susan of the original trilogy. She has the capacity to be likable, is what I'm getting at. So, although I'd argue she's on the more irritating side in Long Haul, I can imagine an adaptation that frames her in a good light, as this film attempts to do. Having her want the family to go on this trip so they can form memories before it's too late is a great motivation for getting us to understand where Susan is coming from with her actions. Unfortunately, that motivation is rarely touched on for a majority of the runtime, and regardless of if it were explored better, it's drowned out by her being the most hateable fucking bitch in existence. I have heard endlessly about how bad Rodrick is in this movie, probably owing to him being a more universally beloved character, but Susan is 100 billion trillion % worse in that she's unmistakably the villain here, but the film itself doesn't seem to be aware of that. And I don't need to come up with some deep analysis to prove this, just look at her behavior across the film. She encourages the trip over taking a plane, confiscates everyone's phones for a multi-day trip, including Frank, who needs to work, forces them to go where she wants, gets mad at them for not liking her choices, insults and belittles them using the kind of comments you'd expect Rodrick to make, and after they finally oppose her to go someplace they want, she embarrasses Greg in front of a live audience, says he's grounded for life, and literally tells him he doesn't care about their family before storming off like a child. That's the type of character she is at all times, and oh boy, does it get insufferable quick knowing she doesn't command an ounce of respect the original had. She couldn't wring out a drop of sympathy to save her life. At best, her actions come off like a vanity project, valuing what she sees as good family bonding over letting it happen naturally through doing what the whole family would enjoy, and at worst, she's a bipolar bitch that cares more about the perfect image of a family she desires over accepting the one she has, chastising them for having the audacity to defy her. In a better adaptation, this kind of psycho-authoritarian abuse would get called out, but it's not. In fact, Greg is the one depicted as being in the wrong for replying to her claim that he doesn't care about their family by saying she doesn't care about what he loves, otherwise he wouldn't have to have run off in the first place. And this is supposed to be a shocking moment, like, whoa, I can't believe he said that, how insensitive. But no, I'm on his side. You brought this upon yourself, Susan, you're the one to blame here. You don't have the right to do a mic drop moment by saying, I'm done fighting, and giving Greg his phone as though you've somehow made a powerful statement. You have been instigating conflict from the beginning. This is the equivalent of an abuser going, I'm done hitting you, and handing them the belt knowing they won't use it for anything. That's gaslighting 101, you cock. And I have no idea why, my theory is Stockholm Syndrome, but the family joins in on shaming Greg, going as far as to blame him for their stuff falling out of the boat as a result of a faulty cable. That's some horrid Henry's dad blaming him for the traffic type shit. The difference being that one is played up for comedy and the other is meant to be taken dead serious. I can't fucking believe they try to have emotional moments of these guys talking about their family history and sticking together when they're the most dysfunctional, mean-spirited, one-dimensional garbage fire of a family I've ever seen. And why are these moments here to begin with? They aren't in the books, there was no need to include them. Oh wait, I know why they did it. It's so they can pretend to be a continuation of the original trilogy and a reboot simultaneously. But hold on, you may be wondering. Aren't those oxymoronic concepts? Yes, they are. To reboot a franchise would mean resetting the status quo from where it began and going again in a new direction, while a continuation would stick to the original story and continue on as another part of it. But not Long Haul, no sirree Bob. Long Haul wants to do both. It wants to be a reboot by having a new cast with reset personalities and setting itself more transparently in the modern day, but aside from that, it does everything in its power to make you think this is just another film in the franchise. The music is the same, the editing is the same, it has the same kinds of animations, interjections, title cards, end credits, opening narration in front of a drawn background while holding the current diary. It's all meant to be as familiar as possible to give the feeling that nothing has changed. But things have changed, and I'm not just talking about the cast, no. Every narrative decision this film makes is in strict opposition to what the trilogy stood for. The family having depth? Nope. They're caricatures now. Fuck you. The iconic secondary cast? Gone. They all died off screen in a car crash, except for Rowley, who shows up for like 2 minutes to remind you he exists. A brilliant structure for events that repurpose scenes from the books to create new stories? I think not. Here, have a bland, slow, straightforward recreation with a GamerCon added near the end. Oh, you're shaking things up there. But what about the trilogy's timelessness? Remember that? How they mostly stayed away from pop culture references and used an indie rock soundtrack to keep them from getting dated? Granted, it didn't always pan out that way. There was, God bless us, the infamous Rowley Numa Numa parody in Rodrick Rules, but still, they did their best to avoid being too time-sensitive. In Long Haul, Greg becomes a 2009 top text, bottom text, impact font meme. I hate my life sometimes. But possibly the biggest fuck you this film gives to the original franchise has to be that every permanent change the originals made has been regressed, invalidating all those films did to return to business as usual through an artificial replacement. And artificial really is the right word, because this cast does not feel like a family at all. Something that used to be seen as integral to making sure their chemistry was genuine. If you look at the first movie diary, there's a whole section section dedicated to talking about how much time was put into finding the right actors, organizing family nights to help them get acquainted with each other before filming. There was loads of thought and effort put into making the Heffleys as believable a family as possible, and that comes through in their performances. Plus, you can tell they had a lot of fun during filming by looking at interviews, bloopers, and behind-the-scenes stuff, where they tell stories of playing games and pranks whenever they could. They've got such a playful atmosphere, especially compared to Long Haul, where, looking at all the same types of resources, nobody looks like they want to be there, and why would they? From start to end of filming, they were getting splashed with shit, sitting around in a stuffy car, slowly realizing their careers were probably over after this, and as far as I can tell, none of them knew a thing about each other before filming. If you look at the subsequent movie diary, there's this bit copying the first about doing screen tests to find the right Rowley, but Rowley doesn't matter here. More than ever, this Wimpy Kid film is dependent on the chemistry of the family, so that should have been the primary focus. At the bare minimum, they could have at least made sure they looked like a family. If you saw the original cast out of context, not knowing they were actors, you'd have no idea they weren't related. Meanwhile, you look at this cast, and none of them look anything alike, most notably Rodrick, who, besides resembling a titan whenever he opens his mouth, is unmistakably Asian. Like, I never hear people bring this up, but it's fairly obvious, right? Are we supposed to not point that out or something? I looked it up, the actor is apparently half Japanese, and man, you could have fooled me. How do you get something as basic as the ethnicity of a character in an all-white family wrong? Maybe if he was just that good, I could understand, but
you're the worst mom ever!
Yeah, no, I think they just didn't give a shit, and that's how I describe this whole movie. They could have found the right cast, put some effort into reshaping the narrative, gone through a couple rewrites to make sure everyone was likable and in character, picked a side between rebooting and continuing where the last film left off. But that would have been hard, so why bother? They know what they're doing. Everything's gonna be fine. Oh. Alright, so maybe mistakes were made. Diary of a Wimpy Kid: The Long Haul is a perfect representation of why a reboot isn't always as simple as casting new actors and expecting everyone to go with it, nor should every adaptation be too similar to its source when that material isn't suitable for film or simply isn't that good in the first place. Despite my sarcastic tone, I can tell Kenny wanted to recreate the vibe of the trilogy with its emotional beats and characters falling out, but he fundamentally doesn't seem to get why those moments worked as well as they did. You weren't gonna pull at our heartstrings by inserting a third act breakup out of nowhere and resolving it like a Hallmark special. It needed build-up, detail, charm, the ability to know which parts of the book would fit best for the story you wanted to tell. But most importantly of all, it needed a heart. And this felt empty. Not one element works. It's also overtly inept in its understanding of why the films were good. It almost makes me wonder how badly the trilogy could have turned out if Kenny were at the helm. But thankfully, we live in a world where that isn't the case. God, I need to stop opening my mouth. Anyway, so, treating live action like a cartoon where you could switch out the actors without anyone noticing wasn't working out, huh? Guess that means the only logical option from there would be biting the bullet by making animated films. And why not? Wimpy Kid is drawn in a distinct, simplistic art style. I'm sure it could look good. Okay, I see. This isn't technically the most pressing element adaptation-wise, but it's the first thing we see, and they hardly get better with time, so I'm just gonna address the elephant in the room here. These films, all three of them, look terrible. Fucking garbage. And there are several problem areas I could highlight, like the distinctly auto-generated shading, floaty movement, boring shot composition, weird lip-syncing, or its total inability to render liquids, but the issue I think lies at the center of it all is that the character models are seen from all angles, but I don't think they were designed with that thought in mind. I mean, look at Greg's nose and profile. Ew, what the fuck am I looking at? Did God pinch the base of his bridge so he'd have permanent breathing problems or something? And the less we say about Manny from any angle other than profile, the better. Ugh. These are the kind of uncanny design choices that couldn't have been made without a weird shift in priorities from another style, and that's exactly what happened. People have been passing this one clip around for a while, but in case you haven't seen it, here's a test animation that was released to give a glimpse of what the films might look like, and it's great. There's a far better implementation of depth, the colors are more vibrant, there's a minor usage of 2D speed lines to help convey motion, it utilizes squash and stretch, but most importantly, as you watch Greg move, you can see his features slide around and morph so that they're always facing the camera, adding this stylized 2.5D aesthetic to the animation. It's a technique that resembles one previously used in the Peanuts movie, where instead of having regular 3D models that are fully rendered all around, they created a few poses for each limb at certain angles that were switched out whenever necessary, essentially using the medium of 3D animation to put characters on a 2D plane. It's a fantastic workaround for giving computer animated projects a vibe that matches hand-drawn illustrations, and it makes weird shots like these near impossible since every element of the character is pre-approved. There are undeniably a ton of benefits that come with this presentation choice, and as the test proves, it would have worked just as well in the Wimpy Kid style. But it also would have required a decent budget and loads of intentional shot choices to look nice. Two things this film glaringly didn't have. So, and this is pure speculation, I'm assuming that for the final product, they took the base models of characters from one angle and turned them into 3D models, not gathering that they were posed so specifically for a reason. To not look fucking terrifying. And I mean it. This shit is so ugly, it almost makes me wish it was straight up done in 2D. Seeing as it wouldn't exactly be cutting edge, but I'd take anything over these deformed blobs. And don't even get me started on how the art style of the books was used as a nod to how Greg sees the world, such as drawing every girl he likes similar to him as a reminder of his narcissism and lack of knowledge on women, which is totally lost in translation here, I guess implying the way he draws the world is flawless apparently. But then again, what does it matter how this looks if the actual writing stays solid? Come on, I'm asking a question here. It's not like this gave an answer. The best way I can describe the writing of these films is if that infantilization comment I made about Greg in The Long Haul was fully realized and applied to the entire narrative, turning it into the exact type of story the books were created to subvert. Now, same as the meaning behind why Greg getting hurt and losing is funny, I didn't think I'd have to explain this, but part of why Wimpy Kid made such a splash on release was that it challenged the status quo of outcast stories. There are a million pieces about happy-go-lucky dorks that enter middle or high or whatever school and have a hard time fitting in despite being so quirky and likable. It's a well-known format that a lot of people enjoy, and admittedly, it's been used to great effect a number of times to make for some iconic media over the years. But here's another thing those stories are: unrealistic. And for the record, there's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to have stories that go for a little idealized reality. It makes people feel good. We like happy adventures about plucky underdogs overcoming the system and getting where they want to be. But we also have to admit that isn't always how it turns out in real life. Not every friendly nerd is gonna make it with the popular kids. Not every outcast is worth befriending. Sometimes, in this desaturated real world of ours, people cause themselves to be outcasts by acting generally unpleasant or toxic. And that's Greg Heffley. He isn't friendly, he isn't likable, he isn't quirky. He's the antithesis to all that. A schmuck that cares only about himself, who considers everyone else disposable. And that's realistic. I said it at the start of this video, and I'll say it again. We've all met or been a kid like Greg who thought they knew everything, and it's satisfying to watch that type of jackass get taken down a peg for thinking as much. That's the charm of Wimpy Kid we slowly saw evaporating in Long Haul, and in this new series of films, we have reached critical bypass. To say that Greg doesn't resemble his book counterpart anymore is an understatement. He has become everything he wasn't supposed to be, and it's not a subtle shift either. Kenny tries to gaslight you into thinking otherwise by having him kick off the film reciting the iconic opening pages, just as the live action did before, but don't get it twisted. This version of Greg doesn't have any of the conceited confidence he's known for. That much is obvious by the time you figure out his dilemma this time around is, get this, going into middle school totally overwhelmed, not knowing what to do or having anywhere to fit in while Rowley gets popular. And I know me saying that in a mocking tone sounds a bit weird, given that so much of that is blatantly lifted from the live action, so let me clarify. I'm mocking this because it clearly wants to tell a more streamlined version of the original film with one or two minor additions of its own, but it misses that for this story to work and be subversive, Greg needs to be an unapologetic dick. What made the contrast of Greg failing while Rowley ascended so interesting was that Greg insisted on being cool and abused his power, attempting to get Rowley to grow up when he was the one being childish. We're supposed to see Greg continually fall on his face from being an ass until it loses him the one good thing he had going, his friendship with Rowley. But this Greg isn't the self-obsessed jerk we know and hate. Shit, this guy isn't Greg at all. He's a regular kid that occasionally does jerky things. You never get the impression he thinks highly of himself or has everything figured out. To the contrary, he gets most of his information about middle school from Rodrick. Information that, mind you, he originally knew and told the audience. They have intentionally dumbed Greg down in this, replacing his self-aware arrogance for naivete. Also, they can put greater emphasis on how unprepared for middle school Greg and Rowley are. I suppose it's meant to be Kenny's own take on the social hierarchy from the original film, but of all the elements to keep, why would you choose the one that's predicated on Greg being an asshole? The purpose of the social hierarchy was that it served as a motivator for Greg to ditch his friends and do horrible shit, culminating in him recognizing as much and giving up climbing the ladder knowing it's meaningless. That's why it was there. But Greg doesn't try to climb the social ladder or change Rowley in this. There's no arc for him to have, so it just boils down to him being socially ostracized and getting mad at Rowley for leaving him behind, leading to a fight and makeup that doesn't matter or hold any major significance. Maybe it could have held some weight if Greg and Rowley's emotional drift were as narratively compelling as it was in the live action, but even that's been dumbed down. Disregarding how the idea of dropping Rowley wasn't Greg's own opinion, but a fear he got from Rodrick, again simplifying Greg's character to amplify his innocence, there's this one critical conflict in the book and live action that's great in them, but absolutely butchered here. The safety patrol confession. The crucial moment where Rowley finally breaks things off with Greg, who, after being conflicted over how to handle getting punished for messing with kids, lets Rowley take the fall for something he did. It's a great scene in both the book and film in that, although you could potentially excuse Greg's behavior earlier on, this is undeniably a shitty thing to do. You can't find a loophole to make this look less bad. It's a move that's meant to be as scummy as possible so we, as well as Rowley, can truly understand without a shadow of a doubt that Greg is a terrible person who doesn't deserve Rowley's friendship if he's just gonna abuse it. But hold on a second. How can this scene exist in the animated film when Greg isn't a terrible person, doesn't screw over Rowley once, and every extracurricular the two had, including safety patrol, has been removed? Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that they can't do it. It's literally not possible under the circumstances of this film. But, you know, Kenny still wants to convey that same sort of emotional conflict as that scene, so he comes up with his own. And considering his track record so far for writing heartbreaking emotional turmoil, you already know it's fucking dog shit. They don't have any of the pieces to build so much as a fraction of the power the original scene had, so as they've done so many times so far, they simplify it down to Greg makes Rowley lie about how he got his arm broken, and he feels too guilty to tell his parents the truth. What? Oh, you thought there would be something more to that. No, seriously, that's it. It isn't anywhere near as bad as what Greg did before, nor is it what ends up breaking the two's friendship, but the music and narration suggest it's supposedly on an equal level of betrayaliness, despite it never coming up again in the film. Greg forcing Rowley to lie about his injury doesn't end up having any relevance on the plot or the two's relationship. Not to mention, it's severely out of character for Greg, who normally wouldn't sweat something as simple as a lie that doesn't hurt anyone. So with that in mind, the only justification I can see for it being added, besides once again infantilizing Greg, is as one of those super condescending after school special type messages. You know the ones. The kind of blatant, unambiguous this moral shilling where Michelangelo and Bugs Bunny show up to tell you that doing drugs is for squares. Except this time it's Greg Heffley letting you know to tell your parents what happened when you get in trouble. All it's missing is a fourth wall break wink to the audience to say that they're serious, but they can have some fun too. It's so belittling that they turn Greg's character into a stand-in for kids who've messed up being told what they should do in this situation. The Diary of a Wimpy Kid series is intended for children at the end of the day, but not once were they ever this moralistically pretentious. They were the opposite. The original joke of the book was that Susan told Greg he should do the right thing, making you think he'd confess to what he did, but it turned out that to Greg, doing the right thing was leaving Rowley out to dry. It was satire. That's what the books were all about. How does the author of the books not understand this? Was appealing to a younger demographic really so worth it that he would forsake the book's original purpose to do so? Also, Greg could be seen as less of a dick? Why? What's so wrong with Greg being a bad person? That's who he is. Concocting a non-cynical, non-judgmental, not self-aware, not in control, mildly sarcastic but good at heart Greg is about as logical as turning Rowley into a dick. What do you mean they do that? Somebody give me a fucking sedative. Oh god. So as it turns out, for whatever godforsaken reason, Rowley is sort of a prick now. He isn't that way at all times, usually being more of an exaggerated take on his character from the books, but when he does gloat, insult Greg, steal his comic and say he can't help being funnier, allow his goons to beat Greg up right in front of him without saying anything, and so on, it sticks out like a sore thumb since Rowley in the books would not do that, and Rowley in the live action definitely wouldn't do that. It's so flagrantly out of character for him, and worse than that, it creates this weirdly bitter atmosphere around his and Greg's falling out, making it so instead of one character clearly being in the wrong, they both come off like dicks that deserve each other. Actually, Greg might be better. At least he apologizes for what he did thanks to his mom becoming his floating head conscience or some shit. I don't know, this thing sucks. As a film, it's technically better than Long Haul, but as an adaptation, it's worse. 100 times worse. This does everything wrong in adapting both the book and the live-action movie, retaining none of what made either of them good. Long Haul was hilariously incompetent. This isn't funny. Fuck this movie. Anything would be better. So yeah, this is better, isn't it? But also, it is kind of worse in other areas that weren't a factor before, so they basically cancel each other out and come around to being the same level of quality, don't they? Okay, let's begin with the positive, because if I have to yell anymore right now, I think I'm gonna pop a blood vessel and have a seizure, which would be preferable to— Nope, positive, right. I appreciate how, in this movie, rather than taking directly from the live action and scrambling everything around to be worse, it tries to expand on the original film's family drifting apart bit by making it a more prominent theme that's addressed during the ending. That's way better than anything the first film presented, and shows a want to add on to the work instead of sacrificing pieces of it to create some unholy Fullmetal Alchemist homunculus representing the desperate, broken desires of its caster. Good job making a change that doesn't destroy everything, guys. This time, it only destroyed almost everything by still being a reimagined part of the film crammed into a wannabe adaptation of the book, making for a confusing, overly complicated clash of ideas. See, in the original film, the connective tissue of the story was Susan pushing Greg and Rodrick together, hoping they wouldn't grow old and distant. It's this notion that, at first, you assume is just one of her well-intentioned, woefully out-of-touch mom chores, purely there to get the two interacting more, but eventually, it grows into this genuine sentiment as the two earnestly get closer. They develop this fun, wholesome dynamic that draws you into the two's relationship so that when they deliver that heartbreaking third-act breakup, it gets you to fear the possibility of that thought to be baseless concern, hoping they can make up. There's a very clear setup, rising tension, and payoff that's not too in your face, but comes back into play at just the right moment thanks to the brothers developing such a well-defined chemistry. And to the animated version's credit, they do get part of this right. It doesn't really get introduced as a plot point until after the two start bonding, but seeing Frank look at them hanging out and feel anxious from the rift he experienced with his own brothers was interesting. That's a side of Frank we've never gotten to see before, and hearing it explained in further detail by the grandpa who worries about Greg and Rodrick's relationship is almost touching in its sincerity, but there are a couple major roadblocks that keep me from enjoying or unapologetically praising this. First of all, for all the talk of Frank and his siblings falling apart over the years, representing what Greg and Rodrick don't want to become, it surprisingly doesn't get any kind of proper resolution. I mean, Greg and Rodrick are okay by the end, but what about Frank? Are we just supposed to forget about the broken state of his family or how Rodrick and Greg could use their newly found brotherly friendship to mend the gap? Pretty weird that situation doesn't change and presumably stays as broken as ever to this day, but second and way more importantly, while the message in this film is less contrived than the "you should tell the truth" routine of the last one, it still feels cheap and unearned on account of Greg and Rodrick's relationship not being like it is in the live action, but the book. And if you were paying attention to what I said before, you'd know that's a problem, but for those watching this video in increments instead of all at once, Greg and Rodrick don't have nearly as close a bond in the books as they do in the live actions, and for God knows why. Despite the film being about their relationship, that non-existent bond is translated here, if not worse, given how little we've seen them interact so far. Remember when the original film added these extra scenes showing how the two interacted so we'd be aware of their usual shtick leading into Rodrick Rules? No you don't! Unlike the original film, Kenny might have come into these knowing there'd be more than one, giving him all the reason to add similar character building early on, but he doesn't. In the last film, Rodrick was there for a grand total of one scene lasting for 3 minutes, barely getting the time to leave an impression before fading into the wind, marking yet another casualty on that film's crusade to cut out anything it labeled non-essential. And the thing is, it technically was. The original Rodrick Rules is undeniably better with the first film's added context, but even if you don't know anything about the franchise, you can understand the journey Greg and Rodrick go through. It opens with the two basically at war, getting closer and closer to ritualistic combat as the film goes on, until a secret party brings them together in the bonds of shared secrecy. It's good and simple, but not simple enough for Jeff Kinney. Nah, he makes the real time-saving decisions, like, why do we need to demonstrate the status quo when we can have Greg tell it to us and skip right to the party? Genius! After all, as the old screenwriting saying goes, tell, don't show. Why are you showing me that? You could have told it to me way quicker. Who cares about visual storytelling or exposition? Pussy shit! You throw that audience member into your world and they can figure it out for themselves. We've got an inciting incident to ruin, and oh boy do they. So, I didn't mention this before, seeing as I didn't think I'd have to, but the book and live action film have two different approaches to the subject of the party. In the film, as we know, Greg has fun with Rodrick, bringing them closer together until the party gets found out, while in the book, Greg ends up locked in the basement and doesn't get out till Rodrick needs help cleaning, saying they'll otherwise get punished together, and the whole thing getting found out is a big joke. Now, they're both iconic scenes in their own right for varying reasons separate from one another, but the point to focus on here is that they set the tone for the rest of the story going forward. So, which one of these routes do you think the animated movie takes? Let's make a game out of it. Write A for the film, B for the book, and get fucking owned because it was actually C. Both and neither at the same time. Yeah, you heard me right. Instead of picking from one of two perfectly good, polar opposite storylines, this version combines both by having Greg get locked in the basement all night, help Rodrick the next day in exchange for advice, and hold the party over Rodrick's head to keep getting advice until he accidentally reveals the pictures he took to Susan. Oh, Kenny, you've done it again. And I mean that in the worst possible way. My god, there are so many angles I could tear this apart from, but starting at the most obvious flaw, everything about Greg and Rodrick Rodrick's bonding, quote-unquote, is based off a noticeably forced premise. It already begins super artificially by giving Greg this new trait of wanting to learn things from Rodrick, an idea that makes no sense, as in every prior adaptation they've mutually disliked each other, and that's sort of consistent here. Rodrick still doesn't want to hang out with Greg, and Greg shouldn't have any incentive to want to hang out with Rodrick, but the film needs to happen one way or another, so inexplicably, out of nowhere, Greg longs for the knowledge of a brother he's only known to be a lazy idiot so far. There wasn't any specific catalyst for him wanting to do this, no moment of genius opening Greg's eyes to Rodrick's true intelligence. It's just a new motivation that popped right out of thin air to get the plot moving. And if that weren't contrived enough, need I remind you that Rodrick teaching Greg doesn't come from a personal want like in the live action, but as a result of Greg literally blackmailing him. Like, that just about destroys anything sincere about the two hanging out or getting close. And I am convinced that the film knows. It's not oblivious to how fucked up this situation is. Why else would Rodrick perpetually be an asshole to Greg before and after they supposedly become friends? He's gotta be hating it. All that's keeping this theory from being cut and dry is that Kenny, being how he be, imitates the original's party gets found out moment. And do you want to guess what Rodrick's reaction is this time?
I thought you were cool. Guess I was wrong.
You can't make this shit up. Or I guess Kenny did, but he's an anomaly of a man to say the least. No one else other than him could have come up with the emotional gut punch that is, "You're so cool." Not. Truly a master of dialogue. I would be blasphemous to so much as think of questioning it, but I'll do it anyway. Since when? Rodrick thought Greg was cool? No, he didn't. He fucked around with Greg at every chance, not demonstrating an ounce of respect or sympathy until the end, where, out of nowhere, once again, they have this stupid-ass, unearned fucking heart-to-heart about how they'll always be there for each other when it counts. What the fuck am I watching right now? When did Wimpy Kid become this bitch made? And I'm not talking about being emotional or whatever. I mean, this is sappy, forced, and in service of a message that wasn't well executed. And it isn't helped by how much Rodrick straight up sucks in this. To be fair, as a character detached from the Wimpy Kid franchise, he isn't as annoying as Long Haul's dumbass Rodrick, but on an adaptation scale, I say with my full chest that this is the worst Rodrick there has ever been. All the media that's come along so far has defined that there are two main routes you can take the character: hard-headed dumbass with occasional skill, or lovably douchey one-track minded genius. Animated Rodrick, as you'd expect, takes a few traits from both, the douchiness, idiocy with occasional skill, what have you, but there's one crucial element this Rodrick misses, besides charm, that completely annihilated any chance of me considering him, well, Rodrick. Intimidation. Rodrick, in every other iteration of the character, has a level of fear to him. He knows how to control a situation or himself. He usually is dumb, but if he wants to be, he is a force to be reckoned with. And this guy, whoever he is, doesn't have that. I don't see intimidation. I don't see self-control. Shit, I hardly see self-respect. He may have the Rodrick Rules and perform one or two vaguely similar stunts to pretend he hasn't changed, but same as Greg in the first animated film, this facade falls apart when it counts. Take the after-party cleanup scene. In the book, Rodrick forces Greg to clean, convincing him they'll both get in trouble regardless of how involved Greg actually was. But here, he begs Greg on his hands and knees for help, afterwards getting visibly afraid anytime Greg mentions letting the truth slip. That's where we see the confidence break. He's not in control of shit. The plot hinges on it, as a matter of fact. So, from the get-go, one of Rodrick's core characteristics is revoked for almost the entirety of the film, making his breakdown all the less impactful. In the live action, Rodrick losing control of his life is this poignant tragedy, watching the fire he's kept burning brightly for so long finally extinguished. This invincible god of destruction we've come to know has been dragged down to earth and had his wings clipped, yet he won't allow himself to fully break down in front of the family or Greg. He wants to keep a piece of his dignity for as long as possible, and he holds it in until everything comes crashing down at the talent show, smashing his self-worth apart until nothing remains. It's so impossible looking at him in this state that the longer it lasts, the more your heart aches. Meanwhile, for this Rodrick, that's essentially his natural state of being, so having him cry after Greg suddenly replaces him as the drummer of Loaded Diaper doesn't feel like a dagger to my heart. It feels like a javelin to my brainstem, wondering how could it get this bad? I'm not sure how or why Jeff decided to do it, but Rodrick has been consumed by his ever-expanding infantilization of the Wimpy Kid multiverse. Going from a self-confident douche to a whining emo who, apologizes. It's sickening. The one glimmer of hope in this fucking disaster is that Greg's slightly scummier than he was in the last film and has plans that he causes to backfire. That's at least a step in the right direction. I sure do hope that stays the same going forward. And thus, we've reached a pretty big milestone, boys and girls. Not only is this special for being the most recent, the last of the video, and the first with no live-action version before it, but this is also where the idea of making animated films came from. The way the story goes is that back in 2012, Kenny wanted to make an animated special adapting the sixth and, at the time, newest book in the series, Cabin Fever, but it didn't go anywhere until part of its production was used as the basis for the original Disney film. Presumably, Disney wanted to cover the more recognizable books first, explaining why they didn't start with this, but after those first two were moderately successful, Kenny was allowed to finally bring this entry to film. Why Cabin Fever of all books? One word. Christmas. Cabin Fever is set around the time, and Kenny wanted to do a Christmas film. Though, funnily enough, Christmas itself isn't that big a theme in the book. It is present and ends up being the precursor or catalyst for a good number of events, but frankly, at best, the book is more Christmas adjacent, so yeah, it's rewrite time. But not like Kenny's done it before. He doesn't have any other interpretations to mangle or take from here, so that means he's gotta take a page out of their books, metaphorically, and repurpose what's already there. The only difference is that the live action did it out of necessity to keep in line with their own mythos while expanding on the material, and Cabin Fever does it purely to satiate Kenny's personal quest for Diary of a Wimpy Kid Christmas. You see, despite releasing a good while before Long Haul, Cabin Fever, as far as early entries in the series go, has a story that could work as a film without too many changes. Kenny had run out of original manuscript material right around the release of Hard Truth, so beginning from there onward, they started being centered around certain events, making them more traditional linear experiences. And Cabin Fever handles it fairly well. During Christmas time, Greg wants to earn money, so he looks for work and finds that amid a bunch of shitty school cutbacks, they get rid of a holiday bazaar. So, looking to capitalize, as he does, he decides to host his own bazaar with Rowley, getting into hijinks that lead to him fearing police will get him after a snowstorm that puts the Heffleys on edge. Granted, it's not the most focused story, retaining a smidge of the old book's ADHD spirit, but that's what adaptations are for. They could have easily made it work while fitting everything in if they really wanted to, but Kenny had other plans in mind. Plans that, for the sake of scrapping what isn't needed and keeping it Christmassy, literally remove all the content making up 75% of the book and completely reshape the remaining 25%. I am not joking. Anything having to do with the holiday bazaar and Greg looking for money have been stripped away to go all in on the family being trapped inside. But virtually none of what happens in the book goes down here. Originally, the whole point of the snow-in was finding funny scenarios to test the family's patience with each other as things slowly got worse, until it was revealed to be Manny's fault all along. Now, to be honest, it has always pissed me off that Manny wasn't punished for being a little shit, so I'm thankful that got toned down, but nothing else is altered for the better. They basically took out anything fun to concentrate on one, the family growing paranoid over time so they can have that generic bullshit family is forever makeup scene at the end, and two, Greg attempting and failing not to be bad in front of this creepy doll called Alfonso that supposedly reports back to Santa. That's where the Christmas angle comes in. Greg tries to be good so he can get this special gift by not messing up in front of Santa's helper, but he accidentally destroys a snowplow with a giant snowball and assumes he'll get arrested, and look, I hate it. I hate it so much. Though, admittedly, I've never liked the Santa's helper subplot to begin with, and that includes the book, where it marks one of Greg's first signs of infantilization. And, okay, I understand that having an open Santa atheist in a children's book wouldn't fly for annoying parents at PTA meetings. It's a tricky subject to handle for a cynical character like Greg, but if you look back at the original book, it skirts around this super stealthily by not having him outright state he doesn't believe in Santa, but hint it through how he knows presents aren't always going to be magically gifted to you. It's a subtle trait your average kid could miss without noticing, but that's how I prefer him to actively believing in Santa and fearing what it means for him to watch you at night. That sounds more like a Rowley fear than something Greg would believe in, so making it his opening monologue in the Cabin Fever book is strange, to put it mildly. I was able to overlook it in the book since it was such a small facet of that story, but it's impossible for me to do that here, as the entire plot hangs on Greg believing in Santa and fearing he'll face consequences, even though everything about the situation he's scared of is set up wrong. If the scenario where Greg gets in trouble played out like it did in book, having him accidentally leave a mark on the school and make a big deal of something that wasn't nearly as serious as he assumed, that would have been funny and suited his regular scheme goes wrong, have to deal with its style. Not to mention that, while it was technically an accident, Greg did it under the pretense of selfishly continuing something he was told not to, so there was no mistake he deserved the karma. But that's no longer true in this version of the story. Any malicious or dislikable intent has been removed from his actions, having him accidentally destroy a snowplow with a big snowball he didn't mean to roll. And what's worse, it is treated as a big deal. Like, what? That throws off the comedy of Greg getting scared over nothing, the schadenfreude of him getting what he deserves, and the realism of a kid not getting in too much trouble for what should have been a minor incident, all so Greg can worry about Santa hearing due to this happening right in front of the helper. And that isn't where the forced Christmas shit ends either. As opposed to the book, Frank is kept in the house so the whole family can come together after fighting, there's a big uptick in licensed music for the hell of it, Greg has Christmas story-esque hallucinations and dreams, and of course, Greg gets the special gift he wanted so badly, but decides to give it to the working mom snowplow driver because Christmas. And alright, I'm not gonna lie, I do hate to be cynical about that last bit, as it's one of the few things this special pulls off semi-effectively. There's technically nothing wrong with the scene itself. I'm just miffed by the fact it's not creative or unique or interesting. And what's weird is that if you take away the adaptation complaints, that's a fair critique of this film. It's hardly good or anything worth your time, but disconnected from the rest of the franchise, it's inoffensive, doesn't have any major story problems, doesn't ruin its message, gives its characters more personality than they've ever had in these, and seems to add a little heart, as unremarkably cheesy and surface level as it is. This could possibly be the first Kenny-written Diary of a Wimpy Kid film that isn't simply a terrible knockoff bastardization of the other films, but as a Wimpy Kid film, it's still shit. It's highly debatable if it's the worst or not, I'll give you that, but it throws out almost all of its source material for something barely related. It isn't like Dog Days where there was a thematic purpose behind adding a new third act that felt entirely natural as an extension. No, this was only done the way it was so the author could fulfill his dream of making a mediocre Christmas movie. On the bright side, I'd say it's less terrible than trying and failing to imitate what the originals did, but whether it's mid off its own merits or something else, there's no denying that with each subsequent film, it's becoming harder and harder to justify why they exist. Do they provide something new? Are they fun, ambitious, inventive, faithful? Nope. they're just worse. You will guaranteed have a more positive experience reading the books. There's no reason to watch them. Is that better than being laughably bad? I don't know. At least Long Haul is memorable. If I didn't know it was based on a book, it'd stay exactly as bad as it is with that knowledge. But if you take away the adaptation aspect of these films, they're the most lackluster, unambitious things in the universe. But I guess that's just the gambit of Wimpy Kid these days. Horrible or meh. The magic that live-action trilogy created hasn't once been recaptured since they stopped being released, and that magic won't suddenly reappear until Kenny fully comprehends why they worked in the first place, seeing as he clearly wants to continue being the writer of these films, which to an extent I respect. From what I've seen, it does appear that he's getting better slowly, adjusting to the format and creating his own style, but if he wants people to keep paying attention to these instead of slowly fading away, he's either gonna need to take a sabbatical to make sure these work, or hire a co-writer to help out. Maybe someone from the originals, I don't know, try anything, be experimental, find your footing. If Kenny wants to run a good race, he needs to find the track first, and I hope he does, because the Wimpy Kid films hold a special place in my heart. They were the first film series I can remember actively caring about, and while I'd love to see that same spark again, if Kenny wants to go in a different direction, I'm all for it. Just make sure it's still interesting and still Wimpy Kid. I've been Just Stop. You've been through a long haul. Thanks for watching, and peace out. Another video done. I wonder what I'm gonna do next. Hey, wait, what's that down there? Oh, it was a Tic Tac. Yeah. Guess I look like this now. Alright, see ya.